Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of my new podcast, Sacks on the City, a monthly podcast on all things Toronto and what's on in arts and culture and in our communities, and of course, the exciting things going on at City Hall. And today we're talking about everyone's favorite topic, housing. And so, of course, I am absolutely delighted to have as my very first partner in crime for this, Jennifer Keesmaat, former chief planner for the City of Toronto, and I'm Dianne Sachs, counselor for Ward 11, University-Rosedale, and I'm delighted to have Jennifer join us. Good morning.
Well, it's great to be here. And I saw you smirk when you announced your name. So there you go, the name of the podcast.
I think you did a
Great.
good job coming up with a name, actually.
I think so. I think so.
So we know that housing is top of mind for so many people. The cost of housing is now so high in proportion to average incomes that it is a real crisis, absolutely. And everybody's talking about it, and there is a consensus that we need to do something urgently about it, and absolutely not a consensus as to what we should do about it. So we've got millions of dollars being promised by various levels of government. So what does it mean for Toronto? I mean, we're the economic engine of the country. We've got enormous numbers of people coming, some people leaving. We're under all kinds of pressure. And what are the opportunities and pitfalls as we go forward? So, Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me. Let's start with this question about how do you compare your experience trying to deliver housing when you were our chief planner and now that you're in the private sector trying to build it?
Well, look, we could talk for an hour about that question. One is a regulatory role, and one is a role where you're actually working with the regulators to get the housing built. So they're, kind of on opposite sides. But ironically, when I was chief planner and I prioritized expediting our planning approvals, in part because at that time, and I think it's shifted a little bit, although the numbers have gotten much worse at the City of Toronto since I was at the helm. But at that time, there was just beginning to be a conversation about the role of planning and regulation in driving housing supply. And of course, regulators are just one little piece of the puzzle. And I took it very seriously that there was a concern that the planning department was at the forefront of limiting housing supply. And as a result, worked very hard. I put a team in place. The metrics from my time there are absolutely amazing, even though my budget was decreasing every year and my staff were decreasing every year. We were continually setting higher and higher KPIs and delivering more and more approved units. But one of the things that started to become clear to me as chief planner was just because we were approving them didn't mean that someone was actually building them. Because the only thing that the city really was doing was providing access for the delivery of housing. And, I led a bunch of really interesting things, including the largest massed rezoning in the entire country along Eglinton Avenue, where we upzoned the entire corridor for 8 stories. But that didn't mean those homes got built.
Right.
Um, and so I started to see, wait a minute, there's limits to this role, and there's limits to this role in delivering new housing because we were just the regulator enabling housing, but that didn't mean someone was going out, getting the capital, hiring the construction company, finding a not-for-profit partner if it was not-for-profit housing, and actually getting the housing built. And so I was quite frustrated. The then mayor, John Tory, was quite frustrated because he said, we keep doing these things to enable more housing to get built, and it's not happening. And so the seed was kind of planted through those conversations for me that, oh, you know what? I really care about execution, and I want to be on the execution side of this. And so I made this very interesting progression from early in my career being an urban designer, an urban planner. I wrote heritage plans and transportation plans deeply on the policy side. Then as chief planner, I was on the policy and the regulation side, enabling housing to get built. and then now have transitioned to the execution side, which is actually getting the housing built. And all of those things, one couldn't have happened without the other. As chief planner, there were things that I saw that I was learning that were kind of like clues to me as to what needed to happen next in this next phase of my career. So, yeah, I can go on and on about that, but that kind of at a very high level captures the shift. And look, it doesn't get any easier being on the execution side, as you can imagine. And I discovered, oh, you know what? Yeah, zoning is an issue, but guess what? Banks are an issue, and CMHC is an issue, and the price of construction materials and when you tender a project is an issue. Interest rates are an issue. There's all these things that come together that either enable or limit the amount of homes that we're building in our country.
Absolutely. One of the things that drives me crazy is that half of the new homes that the city has authorized are not being built. And probably more than that now because we see the bottom falling out of the market for
Yeah.
building condos. And then when I try to encourage people to build rental, they say, oh, well, we can't do that. It takes way too long to get your money back. Um, what do you have to do if you get bad tenants and the landlord and tenant board doesn't work and all these promises from the federal and provincial governments aren't enough money. So I have had a little bit of hope that the province, I mean, most of what Doug Ford does is bad for the city, almost everything, but there's one little piece of his new bill. He says that approvals will expire, or at least will be allowed to make approvals expire. So look, developers can't just sit on their approvals year after year, decade after decade. Do you think that's going to make much difference in getting people actually to start building housing?
No, I think it's a terrible idea as well. It's the opposite of making housing as of right. If a developer has an approval and they're not building that housing, there's a reason for it. They can't get capital. They might have a construction team. And this is one of the things now that I have a construction company as well. I have to think about how I move my construction team from one project to another, and how I kind of manage. The risk is that you have big gaps between projects and you have people sitting at home not working. So thinking very carefully within the portfolio of my projects, how I actually deploy my construction team is really critical to running a successful enterprise. As you can appreciate, I don't want to be hiring people and then firing and then hiring and then firing because I've got delays between projects. So that's another really pragmatic consideration. Look, as a company within our portfolio, we have projects right now that are proof that we can't build. And we're waiting for the market. We're waiting for movement on interest rates. So if our approval expires, that means the minute there's a little bit of movement on interest rates, which we are literally monitoring interest rates, we're monitoring sale prices, we're monitoring rents on a day-to-day basis. If the approval expires, then the minute we can go, it means we have to start the whole approvals process all over again, which typically takes between 2 to 3 years. So you're
Well, it's
delayed the delivery of housing.
what he has proposed would expire as a site plan approval. And that's
Yes.
really important because the Toronto Green standards are tied to the site plan approval. We're not allowed to apply them as of the date that the building permit is applied for, which means that we have people who are waiting many years, decades, and when they finally build, are going to build something that was barely enough for the standards of many years ago and isn't good enough for the standards now, which themselves aren't good enough for the world we're moving into. So allowing people to build low environmental standard buildings seems nuts to me. So I definitely want the site plan approvals to expire. I wouldn't feel so badly about that if we were allowed to move the green standards trigger to the building permit application. We've passed a resolution asking the province to do it, but as usual, they're ignoring us.
So I completely agree with your point about the challenge of, and I would argue you've got the same problem with zoning, that our zoning for a variety of reasons has gotten better and better. And you can have a zoned project that someone's sitting on that was zoned 10 years ago that would never get approved today. And yet now it's approved. And so we're going to be building something. This happened recently. I saw a project that was being built and I was like, what on earth? So I went and looked it up and it was a really, really old approval. And I think that is I think that's a risk and a challenge, and in particular in relation to the green standard, as you outline. What I think that the trick is um, if you put more risk, site plan approval is a very expensive process. And right now it takes anywhere between 6 and 18 months. I'm hopeful that we're going to start to flatten that. And I think there are ways to flatten that, and it can be a shorter and less costly process. But if you add the risk of, well, if you don't build out within a certain period of time, then it's going to expire. What you're going to see is developers, people who build homes are inherently extremely conservative to begin with. They're going to become even more conservative, and you're going to see people slowing down even further than you're seeing right now. We're in a bit of a different situation. We have a very different model as a company because we prioritize affordable housing and we prioritize the supply. But I do think you'll see more people who are already sitting on the sidelines. It does add an element of risk. So I think the problem that you're identifying is a legitimate and critical one. What I don't know is what the right way is to solve it. And I'm not sure the expiry isn't going to have an unintended outcome of making more people go, okay, well, I'm not going to spend a couple $1 million on site plan when there's a risk that if I get to the end of my site plan and suddenly rates go up again, I can't even build this thing.
Well, I hear what you're saying. It's certainly not obvious to me that allowing and encouraging people to build the wrong thing is a good idea. Once you
Yeah,
build
for
it
sure.
a long time, the climate crisis is going to devour everything else. And so if the choice is let people build bad buildings or have them slow down, I'm not persuaded that having people build bad buildings is a good idea. I don't
Yeah.
think we should, even the International Energy Agency, which was set up specifically to help the rich West world burn as much petroleum as they want, has reached the point of saying if we want a 1.5-degree world, that is a 50-50 chance of a halfway livable world for young people. It's too late to build a single new gas anything anywhere in the world as of 2025. And anything that's being approved now isn't going to be built before 2025, and none of them should have new gas. And almost all of them are being built with new gas. So we are deliberately, knowingly, in the teeth of all the science, continuing to allow people to build buildings in ways that should not be built and which will lock today's young people into a more and more devastating future. I mean, this is nuts to me.
It's totally nuts. And just don't think the problem and the solution match right now. For example, on that basis, what you're arguing, the bigger problem is there's a ton of suburban sprawl developments that are approved that are not captured. And they're absolutely devastating because they are fossil fuel dependent
In
um, approach.
every conceivable way, to
Yeah,
build
yeah,
them, to live in them, to heat them, to drive
yeah.
to.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this policy does nothing to fix that because
No.
they've got their zoning. And in fact, bizarrely, our Tyndale Green project north of the city, where we're doing like a real demonstration project of a walkable community, it's suburban intensification with mid-rise buildings, a huge emphasis on families and livability. When we went into the city, and brought in our application, we didn't get a fantastic. They actually said to us, well, you could build the underlying zoning. You know what the underlying zoning is? Large single family
Of
homes.
course.
Large
Well,
single. I
no.
looked at them and I was like, they were like, we're not sure about this as a development site. And I looked at them and I said, are you crazy? If we wanted to, we could go straight into a plan of subdivision for single family homes. And instead of expediting through the process, they gave us a hard time, like we were the enemy. And we're like, dudes, we're trying to build something super future forward, but the planning permission right now allows us to build something that's based on a 20-year-old idea of what the city is. So you would have expected that we got welcomed with open arms, but no, we still had to. And I will qualify that. There were some super folks at the planning department who at the end of the day were really great, but we really tolerated a lot of crappy NIMBYism. Because there's a lot of neighborhood NIMBYism where they did want single family homes with 3-car garages, which is kind of what the adjacent context is. So
Well, absolutely. And really clear that urban sprawl is Ontario's oil sands. It is enormously destructive. It is our worst climate decisions. It's among the worst things that Ford is doing to the future of our province, forcing urban sprawl in so many municipalities. It's disastrous for 100 things. But anyway, it's not an issue for the city of Toronto. We don't have any more woodlands or wetlands that are being proposed to be plowed up and paved. We've lost ours already. So let's go back to the city of Toronto. Um, what do you think we're doing right or wrong at the City of Toronto Council? What would you like to see me doing that could really make a difference?
Oh, I love this question. Um, I think the really big thing, there's a really, really big opportunity, and I think it's missing right now. A lot has changed in the world, and even our understanding, for example, of the accelerated impact of climate change has changed in the past 5 years. And I think the city of Toronto right now is missing a big vision around what the future could and should be. And that big vision is about you could hang it on a bunch of different hooks if you wanted to, but one of the hooks you could hang it on would be, how do we create a city that minimizes its dependence on fossil fuels? You could do that. That could be the hook that you could hang the future of the city on. And if you took that as your starting point, it changes the way you approach development. It changes the way you approach transportation. It changes the priorities at the city. And a lot of this, I was at the tail end of the Transforming TO climate plan and really was trying to push the thinking around the number one thing that we can do around becoming a more sustainable city is creating a walkable city, creating a city that is focused on having sufficient density, just enough density to deliver truly walkable urban places. And that language is integrated into the plan. It is not at all being delivered at a practical level by the bureaucracy. Not at all, not even remotely a priority. I had someone on city staff say to me last week when we were proposing a shared street, shifting towards pedestrian priority in a very urban place, something I tried to advocate for, but was a little too early, I think, at the City of Toronto, say to me, this isn't the war on the car. And it's funny, I was reiterating the story to someone recently, and they said, well, it kind of is the war on the car. That kind of is what we're dealing with right now. So I think there's a big vision piece that's missing. What kind of a city are we trying to create? Right now, decisions are made in a very piecemeal, kind of fragmented way. If you take a big idea, you give direction to your bureaucracy. And if the bureaucracy doesn't have that direction, they're the implementers. And right now, there is a massive disconnect between what the politicians are saying and what the bureaucracy is doing. I think the disconnect is bigger than it's ever been.
Yeah, well, I mean, we just did have a debate about chapter one of the official plan, and I did get passed by council, you probably saw, direction to the public service to be implementing how we control land use in order to achieve transform TO, in order to reduce fossil fuel consumption. So we've given that direction. It's also true, of course, that there is enormous public opposition. So we see this public opposition. Oh gosh, we see it constantly. We see it every time we try to improve intensification. We see it every time we try to approve a bike lane. Um, we had people who come to public meetings, most of them say, yes, but not here. Yes, but not near me. Yes, but not my street. And how do you think we can get past that moment where everyone wants someone else to save the world, but not to change anything about their neighborhood?
I think that some of that criticism that this council gets and that that you see in those public meetings, I think it's legitimate, because I do not think that this city right now is delivering on the promise. So if you add density, but you don't really increase the quality of the public realm, people are going to rebel against density. If you add density, but your public transit system, you're cutting service levels have been cut. I know I ride the TTC every day. I see it every day. There's major operational issues. If you add density, but you don't deliver on your transit infrastructure, people will resist density. If you add density, but you prioritize infrastructure for cars, you're just going to turn the city into one massive traffic jam. So this is what I mean about the vision being the hook that all other decisions link back to. And I honestly don't believe that's happening right now. So I think the city needs to start delivering on the promise. And when the city starts delivering on the promise, I think residents are going to go, I get this. And ironically, we saw a little bit of that happen during the pandemic when some of the promises of the city were taken away in terms of being able to access cafes, but other promises of the city started to come into clearer focus. People started to understand and experience their neighborhoods in a really unique and profound way. Well, that happens when you're walking and cycling and you're not stuck in a long commute. So there were some clues as to what the promise of the city can be that emerged in that time. And I think the city is really struggling right now to deliver on the promise of urban life because it's giving in too much. Like, I've been saying this for 20 years about bike lanes. You can't do bike lanes halfway. You can't build a few bike lanes, but not all the bike lanes. You either have to do it or don't do it. And quite frankly, I prefer cities that either do it or don't do it, but don't deliver some bike lanes. Because if you do, you just make the city incredibly frustrating and unsafe for everyone. So some things you can't do halfway. And I believe right now we're in an in-between point as a city. I actually think there's more buy-in to urban intensification than we've ever had in the history of the city because of the places where we've delivered on the promise. But the problem is we need to expand that. Like, I think there's clues in the city that you can see, aha, here we've done it really well. But then there's other places where it completely breaks down and falls apart. So the city has to, this is why I talked so much as chief planner about ravines and the ravine strategy, access to nature. That's part of the promise of creating a very urban place. This is why I was so obsessed with creating a transit network and the King Street pilot. It was about delivering on the promise. Yes, there's going to be a lot of urban density. There's going to be more people in the city, but we're going to be able to walk and cycle more safely. I think the city's become less safe as a cycling city. I really do in the past 5 years. And I am an avid cyclist and I cycle less than I do for safety reasons at this
Well,
point.
I mean, Jennifer, I agree with you on so many things, but I think you're being a little unfair here. Certainly in terms of transit, we're back over 96% of service and adding service constantly. We put $3 million more into making the King Street pilot work again yesterday. And it's back to its design performance after, definitely we had some problems late last year caused directly by Metrolinx. But we're back on track there. In terms of cycling, we have more bike lanes than ever before. They're being maintained better than ever before. The construction zones are being managed better than ever before. Lord knows there's still a lot of room to go, but they are getting better. We have the bike lanes being properly plowed for the first time ever. We have bike lane inspectors for the city going to be doing their work on bicycles for the first time ever this summer. So I think you're being a little unfair. And in terms of the transit, I mean, the city has, I think, tripled our subsidy for the TTC over the last couple of years in order to make up the enormous hole caused by the pandemic and working from home. And it is true. I mean, I'm on the TTC board, as you know, and so I get a lot of detailed look at the challenges facing the TTC. Two-thirds of the delays that we deal with are disorderly patrons, the enraged, the addicted, the stoned, the homeless. Two-thirds of our delay and just vandals are due to that. It's not within the power of the TDC to control human behavior. Most of the rest of the delays are due to construction and congestion. So when you get Metrolinx closing the Queen Street intersection and preventing the streetcars from going through, that causes delays. And we've got Metrolinx, as you know, doesn't pay any attention to the city's requirements or the city's needs, doesn't require our permission, doesn't listen to what we say, and just does what they want. And their vision is it's going to be better later, and so the next 10 years are going to be held to bad. I
Can I
really
just
think
can
that
I
that's
just can I
unfair.
just pause something because I don't want you to be back on your heels here, but you asked me what council could change. You didn't ask me what council's doing great. So I talked about what council could change, and I'm happy to talk about what I think council's doing well as well. But I just want to give a very specific example of the big vision piece. Um, uh, you said that we're back up to 97% of service levels. That's the 97% that was a very, very low bar. I'm assuming before the pandemic. In Tory's tenure, service levels went down every single year for 8 years. So now we've got a low bar here. So now we're back up to the low bar as a city. What's the aspiration? I'll give you an example. Where I live, there's a bus route right outside my door. When we first moved here 15 years ago, we took that bus all the time. We never take that bus anymore because the bus comes every 25 minutes in Midtown. That service level, when we arrived here, it came about every 3 minutes. Then it went to 5, then it went to 7, then it went to 15. Over an 8-year period, it went like this, boom, 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 boom. The service level kept going farther down, to the point where when I first moved to this neighborhood, and I'm also near the subway, but many of my neighbors, most people in this neighborhood never got in their car to get to work. People got on the bus or they got on the subway. They walked one direction or they walked the other. Now people get in their cars because one bus service is almost obliterated, and it got obliterated over a decade. And so part of it is, what are we measuring against? And I will tell you what I'm measuring against for the city of Toronto, because I believe in this city. I have been recruited to go work in many cities across the world, and I've considered many of those opportunities, and I can't leave this city. It's like deep in my DNA. I love this city deeply. I'm passionate about it. So I'm also going to be a little bit hard on my aspirations for the city. And it's because I believe this is such a phenomenal city, and the promise of this city is so great. So the bar I'm going to compare us to, because there's no reason we can't be this city, is Paris. It's Paris, because Paris has transformed in 8 years. In the same years that we've gone like this, Paris has gone like this.
Right.
Paris is primarily form of commuting, and no one can tell me anything about urban form or distances, because Paris has massive, massive suburbs, and those massive suburbs are also swept up in this massive transformation, where the number one mode of commuting now, the highest mode of commuting is now on
On a
bike.
bike. Yeah.
On a bike. That can be us. There's only one thing that keeps us from doing that, which is being too incremental. And that would be I think there's a lot of good things that are happening. You listed a whole bunch of those good things, but where are we going? What's our aspiration? Because if the goal was to bring us back to where we were when Tory walked out the door, no way, because that was 8 years of decline, in my opinion, which is why I was incredibly frustrated. I did a plan for turning a significant portion of Yonge Street into a pedestrian street almost a decade ago now. At that time, it was radical. Now it's status quo, and it's not even done.
Right.
We
No,
have
that's
complete
fair.
streets guidelines. We have green streets. We have some of the most progressive green streets guidelines on the entire continent. They're not being implemented at the city. So this is why I say, where are we going, people? Like, what's the vision? Is the vision to restore us to where we were just before the pandemic? Or do we have to lift our eyes really high and think about, and I believe we can be a city that leads. We can be nipping at Paris's heels. But we're not doing it because we're kind of trying to patch things together. We're the official plan, first chapter, which I think is very exciting. It's interesting because it's trying to aspire to an aspiration that was set 5 years ago. The whole world has moved way, way, way farther beyond that at this point. So going back to the vision, I think we need a big vision for this city. We have to figure out whether we really want to lead. And I think that is in every different sector. And I know the operations are really tricky. It's a big, complex city. And I know they're really, really tricky. But even with King Street, you were talking about King Street's back to the service levels of when it was implemented. That wasn't the vision for King Street. There's a way bigger, bolder vision for King Street where it becomes this massive, almost pedestrianized transit corridor. The example I've used many times is I was inspired by what I saw in Melbourne, but now we're making the aspiration the pilot level. That was the first step of a 5-step plan. And now we're making the aspiration, oh, let's bring this back to the level of the first step. The vision needs to be way up here.
I don't know how to pay for all of that. It's been incredibly difficult to claw back to pre-pandemic. As you know, Ford has taken hundreds of millions of dollars a year out of our budget for new infrastructure. At the same time, we're being dumped with hundreds of millions of dollars of costs for refugee claimants that neither the federal or provincial government will look after. The numbers are doubling every year, which means there's no space in our shelter system, so we can't offer shelter to the homeless. So the homeless encampments are doubling everywhere. I mean, we do have these visions, but it's not obvious to me how we get, and that gets back to this question of the consent of the public. Now we have, uh, you talk about leadership, and we're elected politicians in a democracy. And so to some extent, to a very considerable extent, we have to have the consent of the voting public. And I mean, you talk about developers being very conservative, leaving aside their donations to the Conservative Party. Homeowners in this city tend to be really reluctant to see much change. And they're the people who mostly vote. So let's talk again about how do you imagine getting political consent to make bigger changes when we struggle so hard even to approve a bike lane?
So this is a great question. And I think that I spent a tremendous amount of time as chief planner wrestling with this question and wrestling with the question of how we build constituencies that are informed, that are a part of a future vision of the city. And on this, I have a little bit of a different take than you. I think there are absolutely people in the city who don't want to see change. And I think there is a series of constituencies that want nothing but change. And many of those constituencies are under the age of 35. And they're not precious about anything in the city. Like I would say my generation or even a little older than my generation are. They just want to see more homes built. They love this city in a very passionate way. To them, bike lanes are a no-brainer. They don't even think twice about it. And so I think there's a turning of the tide at a generational level. And we're seeing the impact of that already on the politics of the city. Organizations like Housing Now and organizations like More Neighbors Toronto are very much focused on building a effective, meaningful discourse about change in the city. I think the residents in the city of Toronto tolerate a lot of change, and I think they actually the vast majority of it do it quite willingly. The city is changing so fast. And I do think this is why delivering on the promise is so critical. There's so much change that's happening, getting 4 units per lot approved, that like psychologically, that was a very big shift and a very big change. I think it's a sea change in thinking that almost 10 or 15 years ago was completely unthinkable, but people got there. The majority of the public got there, and now it's almost a non-issue. So I kind of see it the opposite way. I think people are tolerating a tremendous amount of change, but they're also saying, hey, we want if we're going to be adding tens of thousands of people to our cities, we need a higher level of service in maintaining our parks. We want to see our parks better better maintained. And most people are seeing their parks worse maintained. So I think that, you know, the city needs to be having a conversation about that question. I also think that the money issue is a very, very tricky one. I think that there needs to be a very different type of audit about how money gets spent and where money gets spent. We spend a tremendous amount of money on our roads in the city. The biggest part of our budget is on our roads. I think we need to talk about that. When we were in our Tyndale Green project, because it's adjacent to the ravine, we can't do a through loop because the site backs onto the ravine. It's a large site, 56 acres. And so our development involves a loop road. And we wanted this road to be a very pedestrian, smaller scale road. And we had just this huge fight with the city. They wanted a big suburban road. They wanted the road really straight because they wanted it to accommodate big, massive snow plows. And we were like, all that asphalt is bad for the environment. It costs a lot of money to maintain because it's going to be a public road. Like, why are we wasting money on a big, big, massive road through the middle of this site? Those kinds of decisions have a ripple effect on the operations of the city. So I think there's like a way of thinking through this that maybe needs to be a little bit different. And I will say that I think that is happening right now. I think the budget chief is approaching this in a very different way right now than was approached over the past 8 years, which wasn't about investment, it was just about cutting. So I'm pretty confident that there's a lot of hard work going on right now to try and fix that. And I do think we're seeing the federal government and the provincial government step up in a way that they never have before for the city. In particular, the federal government, the city just got, what is it, 400 and something $1 million for housing that can go to systems and processes and execution of housing. That's new money that didn't exist before. So I know these things are hard, but it's kind of like when suburban municipalities are constantly yelling at the feds that they have no money for infrastructure. And I'm like, build different infrastructure. Like, stop building sprawl and you'll find that the financial model works better.
No,
So
that's
I think that's not the issue in Toronto. In Toronto, it's much more complicated than that. But I do think some great work is happening today on the budget that hopefully will start to get us out of this wilderness over the next couple of years. But, there's a legacy of, I think, really poor decision making that this council right now has inherited.
Oh, that's absolutely clear. I mean, we had 12 years of starving the city. And Shelley Carroll is a infinitely better budget chief for the city, I think, than Gary Crawford was. Um, with her view on, okay, how can we rebuild? How can we recover? But we're coming out of a really, really deep hole with as I say, hundreds of millions of dollars having stripped away, and the province promised to make us whole and has not given us a penny for those infrastructure. And so, but I wanted to get back to your point about park maintenance. I absolutely agree. The visible decline of the city is enormously dispiriting and discouraging to everyone. It degrades public trust. It degrades people's interest and willingness in here. And I managed by the skin of my teeth to get $50 million for urgent maintenance added back to the budget, 20 million of that earmarked for parks. It's a lot of money, but it's not very much money. Like, it's a drop in the budget, in the bucket, given that construction costs have more than doubled in the city since the beginning of the pandemic. And the competition that we have with Metrolinx and with all the condo developers is making it just excruciating to do things like build the elevators for the subway stations. And the 20-year process of building those elevators, the 15 most difficult were all left to the end. 7 of those are in my ward. They are all taking years longer than they needed to or should have, because we're competing with Metrolinx and the condo builders to get equipment, suppliers, workers, backhoes. I mean, just all of those things, which means that the disruption for the community is going on years longer than it should. And this isn't a problem that we created or I think could have avoided, but because we're squeezed between the province, which wouldn't change the deadlines and wouldn't provide any money, and the reality of being the construction capital of North America. So yes, we have lots of problems, and yes, lots of things aren't being built, but we do have to recognize that more is being built here than anywhere else. We have more cranes operating in the city of Toronto than the busiest 10 US cities put together.
Well,
Um,
that's why the whole challenge of the cost of building and all those things, like, I'm a total cup half full person. And it's like, yeah, this is challenging, but this is, I can tell you lots of places where it's really cheap to build transit because there's no urban life, there's no urban vitality, there's no growth. So a lot of these, I do think many of these challenges are a product of our success, and we need to evolve our governance to respond to some of those successes. I used to, when I was chief planner, do this presentation. I regularly met with residents associations, and I did this presentation where I had a slide in the beginning, and it basically said, we're popular, like we're popular, like we're the cool kids right now. And with being the cool kids comes a series of challenges that we didn't realize when we weren't the cool kids, right? And now that we're the cool kids, okay, so there's places in the city where people are falling off the sidewalk, pedestrians are falling off the sidewalk.
yeah.
That's a cool kid problem. Our parks, like my neighborhood park is just where I am every morning with my dog, is just like a total state of disrepair. And on the one hand, I'm like, oh, this is so brutal. Like, and on the other hand, I'm like, well, the
It's
park
being
is
loved to
full of
death.
people. The
Yeah.
park is full of people. And I love that. And I love it that our park has become, since the pandemic, and here we live in a city of 2.9 million people. And the number of people that meet in the park every morning and talk about the TSO or talk about local politics or talk about what's happening in the housing market. It's like, it's very cool. It's a very cool thing. It also means there's a dirt-worn path in the park
Right.
that is threadbare. So I kind of see these things as being conjoined. So I don't actually despair because of them, because I think they are a reflection of a bunch of other things that we're doing exceedingly well. Now we've just kind of got to match up and change the way we govern to respond to that.
Well, some of that's going to be people just stepping up. I mean, the park near my house used to have a dirt path worn through it by people's feet, and the city wouldn't do anything about it. Um, so years ago, I spent a whole year with a shovel and a wheelbarrow by myself, shoveling gravel to put gravel on that path. Wood chips would have been lighter in retrospect. And eventually, after a couple of years, the city said, there really did need to be a path there, and they dug mine out and did a better one. But it went from mud to gravel because one middle-aged woman with a wheelbarrow decided we need to do something about it.
Yeah.
So it is certainly possible for groups to come together and take some more responsibility for their local parks. And we can't just delegate everything to city staff.
But we discourage that, just for the record. I
I,
actually believe
yeah.
there is a series of different constituencies at different age groups in this city that would love to put their shoulder to the wheel and actually be a part of building their community, but we don't allow it. We discourage it. Part of it is a union issue.
Yeah.
Part of it is a control issue, the centralized government, which I just think is dumb. So this is why I think this is a really good example of where we need to adapt our governance model. Like, we can't do the things the way we did them 10 years ago. We need to adapt the governance model. I'm a huge proponent of, I think that we should have community-based organizations that are painting out intersections on neighborhood streets to slow down traffic. Because we know that when you paint out intersections, and it's been done all over the world, again, we would not be a leader if we did this. We would
Mhm.
simply be embracing the new elevated status quo.
So
Community
let,
group.
let's talk afterwards about how I can make that happen in my
Oh, I've
work.
got ideas. I've got ideas.
Okay, I'd like to hear the ideas. Um, I'm going to segue a little bit. When you were mayor, you said you had top five pet peeves, and I'm going to read your list, and let's talk about what you think I in particular should be doing about it. So your first one was buses that don't come when you're expecting them. So what do you think I should do about that?
Well, this is an interesting one because buses that operate in mixed traffic, um, you can have all the technology in the world, but you can't fix the impact of other cars on the road. So I'm an enormous proponent of
Bus lanes.
bus rapid transit lanes, get the cars out of the way. I know so many people who used to take the bus in the city and don't anymore. So it's not a cultural issue. We're urban, right? Like, and there's lots of people who take the bus because they have no other choice and are deeply frustrated and have seen their commute times go up. So I will say that it's not that hard to create bus rapid transit lanes. And Boston even did pilot projects with pylons, where they put pylons down on the road to demonstrate how quickly and transformative uh, bus lanes can be in the city. So I think that's the only way that you can address this issue is
Yeah,
by you
bus
have to separate, the cars have to come out of the way. Once the cars are out of the way, you can use technology, you can use all kinds of things. And we've actually demonstrated that when you get the cars out of the way, it's very easy to have a high frequency bus service. And we have some that operate in the city, in our suburbs, and they're very, very effective. Got to get the
Yeah.
car out of the way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Bus lanes and bike lanes, the cheapest, fastest, most transformative things we can do. And so I was really delighted at council to get support of my colleagues to use FIFA as a kick in the butt to get the Dufferin bus lane finally installed down to the X.
Oh,
So,
that's a good one. That's
well,
fantastic.
I got it passed. Now, it's not built yet, but work's underway. And so hopefully we'll get that. Second one, I hear this a lot from constituents, is drivers that speed through residential neighborhoods. Um, and we've got this crazy system in the city is they keep telling us that, all right, if you want to do X, Y, and Z, you have to get an area traffic study. But they've set up the criteria and the gates to get the area traffic study so that areas like mine can never get one, never. So what do you think I should be doing to deal with all the people that speed through neighborhoods and don't care about the kids on the sidewalk?
This is a really good example of what I was talking about, the governance needing to change. The idea of doing that area traffic study, that whole model was based on a much smaller city with a very different structure. That's a governance problem. The governance needs to change for how we can start getting cars out of neighborhoods. So the first thing, which was one of the things that I advocated for in the mayoral campaign, which Tory advocated against, and then within 6 months he began implementing, is lowering the speed limits. But if you lower the speed limits and you don't ticket, it doesn't matter. So you have to actually do those two things. You need enforcement. That's the kind of the low-hanging fruit. The
Okay.
other things are things like, and I do think you need a suite of initiatives. We just talked about painting intersections with flowers or designs or whatever, creating a visual barrier, very, very comprehensively studied. And it's very clear that when you have visual barriers instead of wide asphalt, drivers instinctively slow down. They're like, wait, something's going on here. I need to slow
Right.
down. So that's a very powerful thing that you can do on your ward, on a ward basis. The other is turn restrictions. And again, you have to get rid of the governance problem. The governance problem is actually where I would go after this right now because it's the way the city has structured the way you get the study that means you can't get the study to
Can't
make
get the
change.
study, exactly.
Yeah,
So
so
I
you've
just
got
have
to
to do
change the
things like,
governance. The governance model is broken and is preventing any change from happening. So I would go after the governance model and say, that's a dumb model. Let's go fix this model. That would be my first thing. But honestly, there is a tremendous amount of data. When we were doing the North York Center along Yonge Street, and we were trying to turn that into a complete street, and we did a whole series of traffic studies. What we discovered, vast majority of traffic, not surprisingly, it's all coming from outside of the city, the
right.
905. This is why the 413 is a disaster for the city of Toronto.
Oh, for sure.
Because if people who live in areas that have no transit want to come into the city, what do? They drive. So you end up having a city where the vast majority of residents have bought into, and quite frankly, are willing to live in smaller places
If there's good public space.
In order to have good public space and access to excellent transit. But then what happens? Their neighborhoods get overrun with cars.
Exactly.
Their neighborhoods get overrun with cars. Who are those drivers? They're not in the neighborhood. They're coming from outside of the city and driving. They're weaving their way through neighborhoods to get to the downtown. And so even since that pet peeve thing was taken, I've thought about this a lot. We need to just blanket the city with term restrictions. You want to drive in the city? Fine. I don't care. But don't drive through residential neighborhoods and compromise the quality of life of residents who live here. And I think that was a harder argument to make when we didn't allow the intensification of our neighborhoods. But now that we have allowed the intensification of our neighborhoods, there's going to be a lot of more diverse housing types in our neighborhoods where we will have more renters, we will have more walk-up apartments, and every single person living in those neighborhoods needs streets that are free from commuter traffic. We
Right.
all need that. So we
Right.
need to get the cars out of our neighborhoods. Yeah, guess what? You're going to be sitting in traffic on Yonge Street. That's your problem because there's actually a subway running under Yonge Street. So I don't care too much if you're sitting in traffic. That's your choice. It's your choice. Get
Yeah.
on a bike or do something else. But if you're sitting in traffic, that's on you.
Yeah, well, that's we're having exactly that argument about Avenue Road because that is precisely the issue. The people who live there detest having a six-lane highway where yet another person was killed this week. The people who want to just use it as a car sewer and drive through, well, they're opposed to anything that gets in their way of driving in their car. And then the people in the neighborhoods nearby are frightened that they're going to be overrun with infiltrating traffic. So if turn restrictions are what we need to keep them out, I need to look harder at turn restrictions. All right, well, think
So,
about that. Okay,
okay,
your third one,
okay.
scaffolding, construction scaffolding. So what can we do about that?
Well, I think look, and I'm saying this as a builder. I think we're pretty generous with the way we allocate our road space. And I know that John Tory put some additional fees in place. Um, I do think we need a much more aggressive approach to construction management in the public realm than we currently have. Right now, there are areas where we compromise pedestrian safety all the time. I walk in areas and I'm like, is no one like
We
if
compromise cyclist safety at almost every construction site.
every cyclist safety, pedestrian safety, and I have to tell you, I walk in these areas, I cycle in these areas all the time, and as I'm going through them, all I think in my brain is, if I was running this city, I would be freaking out about the liability. Like, even if you want to take the lowest bar, which is just thinking about getting sued, I wouldn't do it. But if I wanted to create a great city where I deliver on the promise of a high quality public realm, I would definitely not do it. I would have a better, more thoughtful approach. And again, we don't need to invent this. We're not the only high density city building new housing. There's great models all over the world. And we have kind of this very haphazard approach that does not prioritize. Again, it's a governance issue. Who at the table is saying, wait a minute, how is this safe for pedestrians? How is this safe for
Well,
cyclists?
I do every single time.
I know you do. I know you do, but it's not, there's a, right now it's at the level of the individual and it needs to be at the level of governance, right? There needs to be a governance model where we say in all of these instances we prioritize pedestrian safety and cycling safety. And that's not, again, this is a vision, right? Like if you had a vision as a city that pedestrians and cyclists really matter and that we want to deliver on the promise for pedestrians and cyclists, because in the future of the city, walking and cycling is fantastic. It's the best way to get around. It offers a really high quality of life. Then every part of your bureaucracy starts managing through that lens. Definitely
Well,
not what's happening right
Ro
now.
Roger,
Definitely.
Roger Brown's trying, but you're right. I'm going to keep pushing him. All right. Inconsistent bike lanes. We've talked about that a bit. Um, certainly we all know that everyone in a car has a safe place to drive from where they are to almost where they want to go. And almost nobody with a bike has a safe place to ride their bike from where they are to where they need to go. And that every time we add new bike lanes, that improves the network effect, makes it safer, more convenient. I mean, I can ride my bike to work every day because of the bike lanes that were built during the pandemic. So thank you very much. Um, and on the one hand, we only have limited staff capacity and we have an increasingly polarized public. Um, so, I mean, what do you think we could be doing that would actually be faster than what we're doing now?
Well, it's a good question, and I'll say this as a way of giving a glimmer of hope. Um, there was a bureaucratic position for many years that it was impossible to build bike lanes quicker. Then the pandemic hit, and everyone in the whole world started executing the delivery of their bike lanes quicker. Even in Toronto, even though we'd always said, oh, exactly what you just said right now is what was said 10 years ago. We don't have a lot of staff capacity. It takes a lot of time. There's the consultation, there's pushback. Then the pandemic hit. And then just like we overcame barriers in other areas, we overcame that barrier too. So I would say I don't know enough about what the holdups are right now. And I do know that council continues to be pretty steadfast and aggressive. But I would do a deep dive on places like Paris and how they're doing it. And I would emulate their model. We don't need to invent the model, but other places are doing it better than us. Um, I worked with Mayor Sadet Khan before the pandemic in London. I launched his cycling plan. London is blowing us out of the water, and London too has fundamentally transformed how people commute in the past 5 years. We can do it here too. They've done it in 5 years. And Sadet Khan had a tremendous amount of leadership. He had all the problems that we have in the city, including that there's the borough model and all these different issues, and came up with a strategy. He also had wicked political blowback. I went on the BBC at the time that it was launched, and it was weird because it could have been an interview in Toronto. All the same issues, all the same reasons. Like I was like, this is ironic. It was so ironic, but now it's done. And now because they went boom with the network. And my advice to Mayor Sadet Khan was don't do it halfway. Go big or go home. That's how you have to do cycling. It's the only way. In Toronto, we're still, I just want to be careful because I actually think we've made phenomenal progress in Toronto. I don't want to underestimate that. And I frequently, as I'm cycling, I'm giggling to myself and I'm saying, I can't believe this beautiful bike lane exists. I am frequently giggling to myself. And I will also say from where I live, my infrastructure has improved astronomically. But I'm also aware that there's some parts of the city where it hasn't improved astronomically. And I know that that's partly political. There's a variety of different issues. But I think that it would be very interesting to say, to get in a room and say, what would it look like if we built out a plan like London or Paris's plan? What would that look like? And what would we need to do that? But you've got to go through that mental exercise before you open up the possibility of doing it in a different way. And you have to go through that exercise. And we did that with the King Street pilot. I saw this phenomenal priority transit corridor in Melbourne, and I came back and I said, what would we need to do to even begin to do this in Toronto? And that's how we drove it forward and really pushed it forward. So I think we need to, ironically, right now we need to expand our thinking in our minds and think about a big vision and being aspirational. And if we do that, maybe we'll get a big idea and maybe we'll figure out a way despite all of the hard parts. And I will tell you, there's lots of hard parts in getting absolutely anything done. And it was hard
I,
in London. It's been super hard in Paris,
yeah,
by the way.
no. All
Lots of
right.
blow.
Yeah. Last question because we're out of time. Your fifth was not enough sidewalk space. Now, I mean, it's remarkable and wonderful in Toronto that we have so many people on the sidewalk, unlike many American cities. But the obstacle that I'm constantly running into on this is transportation department tells me I can't widen the sidewalk anywhere unless they're reconstructing the road because they'd have to move the catch basins so to give the water somewhere to go. And I've looked at sidewalk extensions and they say, oh no, they're too hard to maintain. They get trashed by those snowplows. I- We only reconstruct our roads every 50 to 75 years and less so that now because we don't have enough money for road maintenance. So how do I get more sidewalk space?
This is interesting. It's a little bit like the bike lane problem, I think, that I don't think the problem is I think that there's a problem of a lack of creativity and imagination. Like I'm sure that if I got in a room for an hour with some civil engineers and some of the folks on my team who are super creative about stuff and said, okay, catch basins are the problem. How are we going to solve this catch basin problem? Someone would come up with a design solution. Like we've turned, you know, computers that used to be the size of a room into something in the palm of our hand. We can figure out what to do about the catch basins in order to widen the sidewalk. So I do think it's about getting the right people in the room and saying, okay, and my advice to you would be, and I did this, and by the way, you and I probably had some similar conversations with some municipal bureaucrats because I too got a lot of these answers. I'm familiar with them. Um, I would just go into that very future-oriented creative space all the time. And I'd say, well, what if we could solve the catch basin problem? Let's suspend that issue for a minute. What would the steps be that I need to take? And then I would learn the steps I would need to take. But I had this problem with complete streets. We did this whole complete street study. And then at the end of the study, I went and said, okay, I now want to weave this into our capital plan and our capital priorities. And I went in a meeting and I won't name names, but someone in the meeting said, oh yeah, well, we have a 10-year capital plan, so we can start doing this in 10 years. And I was like, what? I was like, are you kidding me? We're going to
That's
start.
exactly the answer I get all the time.
I was
All
like,
right.
we're going to start building complete streets in 10 years. Are you crazy?
Yeah.
So there, but to me, again, a governance problem. That's a way of thinking. That's a governance problem. It's not that we can't build complete streets today. It's that the way the governance has been structured is it's a dated model. It's an old model that doesn't work for a rapidly growing, changing city that needs to be changing its infrastructure rapidly to respond to the needs of a diverse population that is walking and cycling and taking transit. So we've got old governance model that maybe worked when we added 5,000 people a year, or maybe works in another city that adds 5,000 people a year, but it does not work in a rapidly growing city like ours.
Okay. So Jennifer, I've got one last pitch and then I really have to go. We're hiring a chief planner. Any interest?
um, Look, it's an interesting question in part because the job has actually changed. So as you know, there's a new director, there's a new development review stream, and there's a new executive director of development review. And basically what that does is it takes the chief planner's job and it cuts it in half and it separates policy from the implementation of development projects. And I don't know that anyone's kind of thought this through in terms of the implications for the chief planner's job, but the job's really changed radically. It's more like a director of strategy job or strategic policy job than a chief planner job now because of the way it's been separated. So, look, I'm doing super exciting stuff right now that I'm obviously very passionate about, but I'm also very I'm very obsessed right now with this question of how people who care passionately and deeply about the city and have skills that they could be bringing to the table can do so. And I actually see myself as being in that category. It's one of the reasons why I created Chief Planner Roundtables. I wanted to be bringing all the super smart people who think deeply about the city into a public forum to be solving our greatest challenges. And I wanted to find a way to actually plug them into the future of the city. The Ravine strategy came out of one of my chief planner roundtables. Growing up vertical, focusing on families in high-rise buildings, came out of those roundtables. So it came out of tapping into a lot of the expertise that exists and passion that exists in the city.
Well, I aspire to do the same.
Awesome.
Jennifer, thank you so much for being my guest on this very first Sacks on the City podcast. I look forward to having you back every year. And thank you for the conversation and all the ideas. I am going to accept your offer to follow up and see if I can get some more ideas from you on painting intersections and getting more bike lanes and maybe even sidewalks.
Fantastic. Thanks for
Thank
all the
you.
hard work.
Well, thank you, everybody. You can find more about me at dianesachs.ca. Listen to this podcast every month. I also have my Green Economy Heroes podcast where I interview leaders of for-profit businesses who are reducing our carbon footprint. And of course, you can always find me at City Hall. Have a wonderful day, everybody.